Greetings and welcome to our viewers, both at the University of Maryland and from around the world. We are so pleased that you could join us today. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland at College Park. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge our co-sponsors, namely the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology that is directed by Dr. Don Dow, and our colleague, longtime colleague, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, also from the Department of Sociology. Also co-sponsoring today's event is the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. I would also like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair. She has organized today's event, and I'm grateful for all that she does for us. And our student intern, Sarah Rissanen, who is in charge of our social media. Now, it's a pleasure to have these two great speakers today, and I extend a warm welcome to Dr. Mondon and Dr. Winter, whom I will introduce to you in a few minutes. But first, just a few technical matters. So when you join the program today, your video and audio will be muted, and you will have the opportunity to submit questions using the Q&A option. It's on the bottom of your screen. Please note that this program is being recorded. That means that by participating, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, or voice possibly being recorded. I'd like to just say a few minutes of words before I introduce our distinguished speakers. Our world has changed in unimaginable ways during the last 6 months since we learned of the COVID virus outbreak. The pandemic has disrupted every aspect of life in every corner of the world. And aside from its biological implications, the virus has struck our global human body and systems and processes that were already weak, exposing the fissures of inequality and social failure. For instance, in America, African Americans and Latino Americans are overrepresented in COVID cases and COVID deaths relative to other populations. The other ongoing social pandemic, the pandemic of racism and its ugly systemic structures, violently displayed in the recent killings of unarmed Black citizens, shows how much remains to be done. We are witnessing a global crisis with extraordinary consequences. And at this time, world unity and the pursuit of justice is more needed now than ever. Yet our ability to face these challenges seems to become weaker, even more so. The Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland has been actively involved in addressing topics that are central to the pursuit of peace. We accomplish this not because we are all knowing and have all the answers and seek to dictate to others the terms of peace, but because we seek to craft a living archive, the words and wisdoms of scholars, intellectuals, lay people, non-governmental groups, and social initiatives in order to assist the cause of peace. We seek a body of tested knowledge that can be used to seek a more just, secure, sustainable, and happy international order. An international order based on shared values and the ethical and moral considerations that are the foundation of better societies. The Bahá'í Chair promotes its vision for a more peaceful world through 5 central themes: structural racism and the root causes of prejudice, learning about human nature, the empowerment of women as a causeway to the pursuit of peace, the challenges of global governance, and the challenges of the environment. Today's presentation falls more directly under the theme of global governance and structural racism. And we are ever so fortunate to have with us Dr. Aurelien Mondon and Dr. Aurelien Winter, who will discuss their book entitled Reactionary Democracy: How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. Dr. Aurelien Mondon is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath. His research focuses predominantly on the impact of racism and populism on liberal democracies and the mainstreaming of far-right politics through elite discourse. His first book, The Mainstreaming of the External Right in France and Australia, A Populist Hegemony, was published in 2013. And he recently co-edited another book, After Charlie Hebdo: Terror, Racism, and Free Speech. Dr. Aaron Winter is senior lecturer in criminology at the University of East London. His research is on racism and the far right with a focus on mainstreaming and violence. He is co-editor of Historical Perspectives on Organized Crime and Terrorism, and another book, Researching the Far Right: Theory, Method, and Practice. It is truly my pleasure to welcome Drs. Mondon and Winter, who will speak to us about, and this is the title of their talk, Reactionary Democracy in the United States: How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. And we will begin with Dr. Winter.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for attending. Today we're witnessing and experiencing, some more than others, a range of developments that we would like to speak to. The police killing of George Floyd and shooting of Jacob Blake, as well as protests, counter-protests, and police crackdowns that followed. The presidential election with Trump ramping up the rhetoric to the emboldened far right. And the liberal centrist candidate Biden being represented as the only hope against the illiberal Trump and racism. The ongoing reactionary culture wars and conspiracy theories, as well as debates about democracy versus fascism in America. The mainstreaming of illiberal eugenics and mobilization of the far right, as well as the exacerbation of racial inequalities by COVID-19 and the lockdown. As well as the emergence of a public discussion about not only the far right, but systemic racism. Their relationship between the far right and systemic racism, and the need to address both and this relationship, particularly in light of the police killing of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter's protest, and the recognition of the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on racialized communities. This, after a long period of post-race celebrations and denialism, which it should debunk, but reactionaries are increasingly using it and other tropes to deny the reality of systemic racism. It is these issues and how we got here that our book, Reactionary Democracy, speaks to and looks at. The book and this presentation will look at four main issues that underpin these, with a particular focus on the US, although the book also looks at Britain, France, and a range of other countries. Firstly, racism in the 20th century, illiberal and liberal articulations. The need to see beyond overt and far right racism to understand systemic, structural, and institutional racism, and see the role of history in it, not something to mark, merely to mark progress or paradoxically memorialize. Second, the mainstreaming of the far right today. Third, the populist hype and the deployment of democracy and the people for reactionary ends. And finally, Trump and the people. Now, just to start, we use the term extreme right for those movements and activists who express what we call illiberal articulations of racism and engage in violence, whether verbal or physical. We use the term far right to describe those movements and parties that espouse a racist ideology, but do so in a more indirect, coded, and often covert manner, notably by focusing on culture or occupying the space between the illiberal and liberal racisms, between the extreme and the mainstream. And these are concepts I shall return to. Next slide. So racism in the 21st century, liberal and illiberal articulations. This is a concept and a schema that we developed originally in our work on articulations of Islamophobia, and we're indebted to the work of others. We developed these to examine certain ways in which racism not only operates, but racism is constructed, deployed, and denied within public and political discourse, and the way it functions, particularly how it is represented by, in a lot of cases, and particularly by the right, in its most extreme and overt forms, not just to oppose the far right or fascism, but in ways often to directly or indirectly, intentionally or not, to deny racism in all its forms, particularly its systemic and its structural ones. In this slide, we have some images, particularly of the way in which racism and Trump's association with the far right, as well as the mainstreaming of racism, came to be articulated and represented mostly by its most extreme forms, as opposed to its more indirect systemic ones, such as Charlottesville. Or in the case of the election of Obama, the way in which this image by Reber Hansen came to symbolize the post-race era, the way in which Obama overcame racism, or his election was a symbol of America overcoming racism, where racism is represented by a Klansman, which is symbolic not of systemic, structural, and everyday racism, but of the far right, of a historical form or historical manifestation. And the way in which, for the next image, the way in which the far right has functioned for liberals and centrists as a threat. And this is not a threat to unleash the far right, or the extreme right, but the way in which moderates and centrists promise an alternative to the far right and to racists, and oftentimes couched in or represented by more moderate and acceptable forms of racism and xenophobia. So if you choose a more moderate form of racism or xenophobia, it can stop the more extreme illiberal forms. Next slide. So we developed these concepts of illiberal and liberal racism. Illiberal racism is often the popular definition of real racism in media and in sort of right-wing discussions. It is often historical in nature. It is represented by that racism which is defeated. For example, Nazism at the end of World War II and the victory of the liberal democratic order, or in America in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act. Or it's represented as a remnant, a form of politics and a form of movements and forms of racism which are out of time and out of place for this liberal, progressive, tolerant era. For example, in the form of the contemporary extreme or far right. But in its most historical forms, it's represented by slavery and colonialism, Jim Crow, biological or race science, fascism, and racist violence. And these are symbols of not only illiberal racism, but that which is either defeated or unacceptable today. Now, on the other hand, we have liberal racism. These are contemporary forms of racism. And as a concept, it's quite an interesting one in the way it's a form of racism that denies its racism. It distinguishes itself by not being illiberal, not being real racism. In that sense, illiberal racism is a functional concept to legitimize liberal democracy and liberal racism, treating liberalism as the antidote or bulwark against racism. It denies the racism within liberalism, as well as the lack of action on structural inequalities and continuity of less overt forms of systemic and coded racism. It uses, as I said, the threat of the far right to push more moderate politicians and policies on issues that may concern the far right. For example, the Hillary Clinton call to stand up against on immigration, but also more recent ads that are pro-Biden but not associated with his campaign, such as #TrumpTerrorism, which associates him with Charlottesville and Dylann Roof, but not the racist policies on immigration and bordering, which may not be seen as unacceptable to swing and centrist voters. The liberal racism has its historical development often in America, within post-race colorblind and progress narrative, that as I said, racism and the far right were defeated with civil rights and then Obama's election. It is often individualized. It sees racism as aberration, an example of individual bad apples. It can operate also through liberal tropes, such as LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, and free speech, something which we've written about previously in the way it's weaponized often against Muslims and Islam. Next slide. Now, to construct these two concepts, we're not saying they're mutually exclusive. They are dependent upon one another. In fact, oftentimes illiberal racism is a projection of liberal racism. But there's also blurry boundaries. The way in which liberal tropes of free speech can often encourage, give rise to, and legitimize the platforming of racism in far right, as well as the idea of debating racism, as if this is a way to clear the air, sort of get at some sort of truth, but what it often does is platforms racist and amplifies and legitimizes racism. Defending examples of emoluments to illiberal racism and attacking opposition to it. The way in which you can have liberal forms of racism, colorblind racism, that defend the memorials to Confederate sort of figures and slavery, including attacks on the 1619 Project. Representing the far right and anti-racism as equivalent, or the latter as a racist and extremist. A frequent argument you'll hear is the way in which anti-racist, Black Lives Matter, or in some cases amongst the sort of intellectual dark web types, the way in which Obama is seen as not as racializing issues or making race an issue, and seeing that in a colorblind post-race context as a form of reverse racism even. And finally, the blurry boundaries, the shared commitments with the far right and mainstreaming. Next slide. Now, next thing we want to talk about is the mainstreaming of the far right. And in these images, we have examples of far right and extreme right figures, such as Richard Spencer and David Duke, supporting Trump. We have Trump's association with Steve Bannon, as well as Trump retweeting far right figures and emboldening and legitimizing far right mobilizations and counter protests against anti-fascists, Black Lives Matter, and other wider anti-racism. Now, next slide. So mainstreaming, some key elements. It is not just, I should note, the far right in the mainstream, not just the far right making links to mainstream politicians and vice versa as allies or interlopers, but also their ideas, even when they themselves are rejected because they're too extreme. The concept of mainstreaming, just for sort of clarification, signposting, can be defined as a process where actors, ideas, and our narratives move from the marginal positions on the political spectrum or public sphere to more central and or popular ones, such as they have an impact on political discourse and policy. Now, it's important to note that concern about the far right and extremism have often been about influencing the mainstream. The mainstreaming of the far right is not new. The mainstream's meaning and position is constructed, contingent, and fluid, as is, or as are, the concept of extreme and far right. Since we posit the mainstream as such, it is crucial to stress that the process has no normative aspects, the concept of mainstreaming and mainstream, and does not necessarily entail a moderation of the mainstream position. Manifestations of the mainstream and mainstreaming processes can thus only be made sense of in a precise time and space and within coordinates of a particular political moment. And what follows from that also is that the mainstream is not essentially good. It's not a bulwark against racism in the far right. This would fly in the face, ironically, of progress narratives, as the mainstream historically would have been racist too. Progress is not unidirectional or inevitable. There are backlashes. There is resistance to progress from even within the mainstream. Far-right parties also move both ways. Referring back to the post-race narrative that I mentioned earlier, it is worth remembering that prior to civil rights, racism, including state racism, and the far right were mainstream and the law. They were racist, segregationist laws and police forces. Racism, including, they were law. In the Native as Second era, when the Klan supported the Johnson-Reed Act, or civil rights in the Third era, it was only after the FBI and House Un-American activities, actions against the Klan in the 1960s, that they were separated from the mainstream and came to become the liberal image of racism, conflated with illiberalism and extremism. The far right, which has undergone mainstreaming now, had been on the fringes and in the wilderness from much of the 1970s and 90s, turning against the government, paramilitarizing, preparing for a race war. Yet racism continued, even in their absence. With Nixon's Southern strategy, Reagan's war on drugs and welfare, Clinton's welfare reform, Bush's law and order rhetoric and policies, and ongoing structural systemic racial inequalities. In other places, such as France and the UK, the far right itself underwent a discursive reconstruction and tried to appeal to and gain access to the mainstream. Party politics, social movements, and discourse can move together, but they do not have to, or at the same time. And mainstreaming is not unidirectional from one source or site to another. The relationship between the elite, public opinion, and the people, which can often be deployed and claimed to justify racist policies and politics and practice, is premised on uneven power relations. Next slide. Elite legitimizers, the liberals, reactionaries, and the media. It's important for us to talk about the way in which ideas and actors and figures move and legitimize these kind of far-right racist politics, often under the guise, as we said before, of liberalism. You can have politicians and advisors such as Trump, Bannon, and Miller. It can be in the form of policy that appeals to a far-right and far-right adjacent base, and retweeting. You have liberals and conservative culture warriors, such as the so-called intellectual dark web, which include liberals and conservatives, Sam Harris, Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, the Brett and Eric Weinstein, and Bill Maher, making the rounds on each other's platforms. I mentioned Bill Maher because, as an example of a liberal, because of the way he has weaponized liberalism against Muslims and Islam, but also the way in which he has opposed and created an equivalence between the far right and Trump supporters and Bernie Sanders in the support of a moderate center and a centrist candidate. Academics and writers who legitimize, amplify, and hype the far right, and supporting narratives such as the white working class left behind, often with the emphasis on white, as if the political establishment must take racists in the far right seriously. We have the media also platforming, amplifying, and legitimizing the far right. And I don't just mean Fox and InfoWars, MSNBC, CNN, BBC, Guardian, New York Times, the way in which far-right actors are platformed and interviewed from Patriot Prayer or Steve Bannon, as if they have some representative capacity or power and some legitimacy. And it gives a way of basically affirming and amplifying their narratives. And the narratives we're referring to are often those that mobilize reactionaries and normalize reactionary politics. about social justice warriors and wokeness, cultural Marxism, free speech under threat by cancel culture, and the bravery, alleged bravery and courage of the racists to speak out against this, the white working class left behind, populist insurgents, and the will of the people, to which we now turn for Aurelien.
Okay, so hopefully you can all hear me. So now we're going to be turning to a concept that I'm sure you've heard many times and you've read about many times in the media, in academia, pretty much everywhere really, populism. Populism is a term that has quite a long history in the US, of course. If we think about the late 19th century, the 1890s in particular, there was a very strong populist movement, which could be seen as a more kind of left-wing movement that originated in a kind of anti-corporatist and anti-monopolistic movement. But afterwards, it kind of disappeared, the populist movement in the early 20th century, and eventually made a comeback. Interestingly enough, the comeback that it made probably started maybe not in Europe, but about Europe, and about the rise of the far right in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, when the word populism was increasingly used to talk about the kind of rise and resurgence of the far right, of parties like the Front National, the FPÖ in Austria, and various others. But of course, it kind of culminated in the mid-2010s and particularly 2016 with what was seen as two massive earthquakes in the politics in the broad politics of the West, which is of course the election of Donald Trump, but also the Brexit vote in the UK. And so for the election of Donald Trump, it was very common to see in the media, as Aaron talked about before, and I'm not talking just about right-wing media here, but in the mainstream media and even the left-wing media, headlines talking about the populist victory of Donald Trump. So you can see here the New York Times, for example, Trump's victory and the rise of white populism. You can see the Atlantic, why is populism winning on the American right? On foreign affairs, populism is on the march, why the West is in trouble. So you can see here something that's quite interesting about the way populism is used. Populism is seen as something thoroughly negative. It's of course the populism that they're talking to move to Europe to seek asylum and refuge. And it kind of went on many tangents. And for example, this one, CNN, Trump's populism is only the beginning. Here comes the robots. And there's many kind of headlines like this that kind of, will use populism in many ways, shape or forms across the media. But it's not just the media that's been in a way polluted by populism. Academia as well was fueled by, but also fueled in the debate in populism. And some work that was conducted with Katie Brown, for example, has shown that if you look at the Web of Science, which is a big database of academic papers, if you look at the Web of Science, the number of publications containing populists in the title, abstract, or keyword has risen from 310 between 1970 and 1979 to 6,482 between 2010 and 2019. Even the 10 years prior, the first decade of the 2000s, there's a massive rise from about 1,000, I think, to about 6,400 in the last 10 years, which is huge. And it's been legitimized by a number of very prominent academics. And you can see, for example, here, Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris, Trump, Brexit, and the rise of populism, economic have-nots, and cultural backlash. This is not commenting on the quality of the paper in any way, shape, or form, but you can see that the choice of title here is quite interesting. They're not talking about the radical right, the extreme right, the far right, terms that used to be far more common in the past. They instead using the word populism. And we think that there are issues with that. The issue is not so much with the concept of populism, but with the way it is used. We don't have the time today, unfortunately, to go into much detail about populism, terminology, and what could be seen as rather boring academic debates. I mean, I love them, but I'm sure that many of you might not be too interested. But if you're interested, please do ask in the Q&A. But instead, what I want to raise here is some of the issues that we find in the book with populism. The first one, and some of them have been touched upon by Aaron already. The first one is that populism tends to euphemize. Instead of using words like, as I said, like far right, racism, or even fascism at times, using the word populism tends to actually limit the impact of the movements we are talking about. It also tends to be less precise and less stigmatizing than other words such as, again, racism, extreme right, far right, and so on and so forth. So it euphemizes is one point. The second point is that it amplifies. Why does it amplify? Because it links certain movements and certain parties to the people. The word populism makes people think of popular and people. Popular people, core to democracy. Therefore, if a party is populist, it must be close to the people, or it must be speaking for the people. This is not always true. Many populist parties in Europe, for example, struggle to get more than 10% of the registered vote. And yet they are called populists, which lends them some credibility and amplifies actually their power in electoral terms. Finally, we argue that it denies the power of agenda setting from the elite. It places the onus on the people. The people give power to the populists. We have seen some definitions of populism, some very popular definitions of populism, for example, who talk about the pure people versus the corrupt elite, as if it was the people who gave power to the populists, rather than actually the elite who control the agenda, who control public discourse, people in the media, for example, or politicians who are talking about certain issues, who are making certain issues prevalent. And so what we argue is that it's removing responsibility from the elite and instead placing it on a people who doesn't have much of a voice and doesn't have much power. So we believe that, in a nutshell, we believe that what we call populist hype has been core to the resurgence and mainstreaming of the far right. And in particular, we argue that it has created an inaccurate and dangerous link between far-right ideas and the people. And the people is often seen as working class, something that Aaron already touched on. Sorry, this is the rise of, I totally forgot about this little slide. This is the rise of the use populist in academic papers in recent years. And you can see the rise that even, from the beginning of 2010 to 2018, it's a massive jump. So now I want to move on to questioning the idea that Trump was indeed, the election of Donald Trump was indeed a white working class populist revolt. Trump's election is often seen as a white working class populist revolt. Again, I'm sure you've seen headlines, I'm sure you've seen many articles in the past 4 years that have been claiming that it is the people in various ways, quite often derogatory ways, who have put Trump in power. And if only it was the middle class liberals of of better educated, more progressive cities who were voting, then we wouldn't have Trump. However, this narrative really tends to go against a lot of the data, and we find that quite fascinating and what it says about it as well. Of course, you don't have to look very far to find these claims quite surprising that Donald Trump is representative of the people. For example, look at who he's hanging out with and look at where he's hanging out with them. In a golden lift with a former stockbroker that some of you might know, this is Nigel Farage, who was the leader of the far-right party UKIP, the UK Independence Party, and then became the leader of the Brexit party. And he played a major role in pushing Brexit in the UK. I'm going to quote Nigel Farage here. In October 2016, a few months after the United Kingdom voted to exit the European Union, and as the US elections loomed, this is what Nigel Farage wrote in an opinion for the mainstream right newspaper, The Telegraph. And I quote, "The similarities between the different sides in this election are very like our own recent battle. As the rich get richer and big companies dominate the global economy, voters across the West are being left behind. The blue-collar workers in the valleys of South Wales, angry with Chinese steel dumping, voted Brexit in their droves. In the American Rust Belt, traditional manufacturing industries have declined, and it is to these people that Trump speaks very effectively." Fascinating quote from someone who is, as I said, a former stockbroker, and who's talking about someone like Donald Trump. And, again, the choice of where they hang out in their golden lift, I think, says a lot about how much we must care or understand the plight of the valleys in South Wales or the Rust Belt in the United States. So it's already quite kind of dismissive of the working class as kind of being able to see through this kind of rhetoric. And yet what's interesting is that the kind of statement that we can see, or the kind of narrative that we can see in Nigel Farage's quote here, was taken up in most of the media. And again, both the liberal and the kind of more right-wing media. The fact that Trump, Brexit, the Front National in France, and various other kind of far-right leaders were populists and spoke for the people, the downtrodden, the left behind, the working class. You can see here another headline from the Washington Post, how Trump won the revenge of working class whites. Is this correct? Well, that's what we want to kind of challenge in the second part of this lecture. This narrative was popularized again, as I said before, with populism, was popularized in the media, but it was also popularized in a number of prominent books, some of them by academics. You can think, for example, of J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy or Ali Hochschild, Strangers in Their Own Land. And this is, of course, not altogether new, this link of kind of conservative Republican voters with the working class. And you can think, for example, of strategies and narratives from the Nixon and Reagan eras in the past, for example. The question is, do these claims withstand even basic electoral scrutiny? Well, we argue that no, they do not. And so let me show you a few figures. Some of you might have seen them. We haven't really discovered anything that's particularly new. What's worth noting as well about our work is that we are not kind of trained quantitative researchers. We don't do crazy, difficult mathematical experiments that only us could do because we have huge computers to do them. What we do instead with our electoral data is very much what any journalist should be able to do. So we don't go any further, and therefore it's not beyond the grasp of journalists to be able to kind of find this kind of data and use it to kind of challenge certain narratives, and particularly narratives which we argue are very damaging, as we will come to in a minute. So just to show you first that it is very, very difficult to sustain the claim that Donald Trump was indeed elected by the working class in the United States. What you can see in this table here is based on the New York Times and Edison research, and it's the 2016 vote according to income. The first thing that's quite interesting to see here is that even by looking at income and the two segments of income that are lowest, under $30,000 and between $30,000 and $50,000 or $49,999, you can see that Hillary Clinton won in both of these categories. So already you can see that if you think of the working class, and again, defining the working class, of course, is difficult and problematic, and we talk about this in the book a lot more. So if you're interested, please turn to this. So we're happy to discuss that in the question time later on. But just looking at income per class, you can see that here Hillary Clinton still defeated Trump. More interestingly, though, what you can see perhaps is that Trump did better than Romney and McCain. Romney and McCain, with the kind of poorest segment of the population per income, got 35% for Romney and 32% for McCain. And so you could maybe say, well, it is true that Trump brought in more poorer voters to him. But if you compare him to George Bush in 2004, you can see that actually the results are very similar. And in fact, when it comes to the second lowest segment, Bush did a lot better than Trump even. What is fascinating here as well is if you compare Clinton to Obama, with Obama doing a lot better with the poorer segments of the population than Hillary Clinton did. What is also interesting is if you look to the left, the size of the category in 2016 is that the poorest segments of the population in the US are a lot smaller than, for example, the people who earn between $50,000 and $100,000. And these people voted more for Trump than for Clinton. What's interesting to see as well is that Trump did best in the wealthiest parts of the electorate. So in terms of income, this is not sustainable. If we move to levels of education, something we've heard a lot about and quite often in very derogatory terms in the United States, we've heard the same in the UK, we hear the same in France as well, and so on. The fact that the less educated you are, the more you are likely to vote for these kind of populist leaders, authoritarians, and so on and so forth. Well, it actually doesn't pan out again if you just look at just very simple data. You can see that Romney and McCain did particularly poorly with the people who were less well educated, but in fact, Trump does very similarly in terms of results again to George Bush Jr., thus suggesting that this again may not be the working class breakthrough that was widely advertised in terms of education. Here again, what you can see is that Hillary Clinton does a lot worse than Barack Obama. Oh, and what you can see as well is that Donald Trump, sorry, I moved in too quickly here. Donald Trump does quite well with people who have some college and an associated degree. So not, again, the people at the bottom of the ladder in terms of levels of education, but the people who are very much in the middle or potentially lower middle class. If we move to a third factor, which is race, this becomes, again, quite interesting. And here we see some differences. Trump's performance is certainly quite strong with white voters, but again, it does not appear to be significantly different from previous Republican candidates. Trump's breakthrough is further nuanced by Kilibara and Rothmeyer's analysis of the myth of the Rust Belt revolt, which demonstrates that Clinton actually lost more white working class votes on Obama than Trump gained on Romney in 2012. So if Clinton lost in 2016, it was more because she lost rather than Trump won, sorry. It is also worth noting that Trump won the majority of white professional males with a college education and over 40% of white professional females with a college education, pointing further to a race, or more precisely whiteness, of a class as a key factor, something which is traditional in the Republican vote. Interestingly, beyond the figures, what was quite interesting, and beyond quantitative data, what's quite interesting is that in the responses to supplementary questions in the exit poll, the answers suggest that beyond traditional Republican electorate or middle and upper class conservatives, Trump managed to appeal to a similar electorate than that which underpinned the resurgence of the far right in Europe. This particular electorate feels insecure about its future, even though it remains in a relatively privileged position and is more interested about issues such as immigration and terrorism than about the economy. They are not the ones who are bearing the brunt of austerity, for example, or economic decline. Therefore, rather than a radical shift of the working class towards Trump, what we have witnessed is a development of a typical far-right electorate by European standards. While this is certainly concerning as a development, the size of this particular electorate is marginal and would not be sufficient for Trump to win if the Democrats had managed to return their share of the vote. So again, I'd like to stress what has been forgotten, and I think it's very much the same in the UK, it's been very much the same in France and in other countries where the far right has risen, is that it is more a defeat for the center left, the center right, when the far right rises, or the so-called populist rise, than it is actually a victory of these so-called populists. A more significant finding, perhaps, is that the largest share of Trump's electorate does not appear to differ from traditional Republican voters, and particularly from Bush Jr. This means that Trump is more of a confirmation of a trend, which has seen a radicalization of the Republican electorate, with racism being increasingly normalized in American politics, rather than a real break from politics as usual. So why does that matter, the fact that we have been associating Trump, Brexit, and the far right more generally with the working class? Well, it matters in 4 different ways, or we argue at least that it matters in 4 different ways. The first one is that it constructs and racializes the working class as white. And it pits an elusive white working class against minorities and immigrants who are denied working class status despite the immigrant history and diversity of the working class, in a competition for scarce, deregulated, and casualized employment and ever-dwindling resources. So the first thing about the working class voting for Trump, or the far right in general, is that it tends to make it a white working class issue. Of course, this is very problematic because, as we can see in many countries, the working class is probably the most diverse class in our society, and therefore it completely erases the history of people who are not white. Second, it constructs the white working class as privileging their racial interests above class ones and as being racist. This results in the very stigma and criticism right-wing populist and libertarian advocates, who are themselves often elites, claim they oppose. So it turns quite often the people who have tried to claim, the people on the right who have tried to claim that Trump, Brexit were working class events, have been very upset when we've called these events racist or xenophobic or nativist. And then they jumped on to say that actually the people who are claiming that these events are racist, xenophobic, and so on and so forth are saying that the working class is racist, xenophobic, which in fact, we are not saying that at all. We're saying that they are not working class events in the first place, but they are nonetheless racist, xenophobic, and far right. Third, it normalizes and mainstreams racism in both discourse and practice by claiming it is a popular demand, thus legitimizing hate crimes and the rise in far-right activity. The working class has very often been seen in our democracies as the core of democratic progress and the core of the people's voice in many ways. And therefore, if the people's voice supports this kind of politics, therefore they have some kind of democratic legitimacy. And finally, in addition to not addressing the inequality faced by white working class people, it exacerbates the inequality and vulnerability faced by racialized and migrant working class peoples, and actually serves establishment political and economic interest by dividing the far right and not addressing the systemic issues that the working class suffers. So to conclude, what do we do? We've painted a fairly grim picture of the situation in the current moment. It is worth noting that we've been working on this book for a couple of years now, really. I mean, the 2016 kicked off the research for this book. So it's been kind of ongoing. And this year, of course, is quite interesting for us to see what will happen. And we argue that things don't have to be this way. We argue that, that there is a contingency in the situation that we are living in. Things are in a bad shape, but they don't have to be this way. And therefore, in the conclusion of the book, we make a number of recommendations. We try not to be prescriptive, but we make a number of recommendations, which quite often are addressed to people who are in a more privileged position. The first one is that we need to stop hyping the far right. We need to stop, we need to refrain ourselves from giving the far right a space it doesn't deserve. We need to talk, of course, about far-right attacks. We need to talk about racism, but we need to talk about it carefully. We need to not fall into the kind of infotainment like narratives that we have seen too often in our media. You can see that quite often in Europe in particular. Whenever there is an election in Europe, if a far-right party is said that if a far-right party is supposed to do well, then the media will talk about it a lot. If that far-right party doesn't do well, we forget about it and we move on to the next kind of election where a far-right party is meant to be doing well. This participates in what we call hyping the far-right, making the far-right look bigger than it is. We need to always remember that racism evolves and adapts. This is what Aaron was talking about at the beginning of the talk. It is not exhausted by its illiberal articulations. So not only should we not hype the far right, but we should be very careful not to put the far right outside of the mainstream altogether. Racism is mainstream and has been mainstream for a long time. There are different forms of racism, of course. There are the more extreme forms of racism, but there are the systemic forms of racism that our societies are still very much filled with. Racism is not only in the other. Racism is not just the skinhead. Racism is not just the Klansman. Racism is not just the shooter. Racism is also in our institutions. Racism is in our day-to-day interaction. Racism is in the middle and upper class and in the educated white middle and upper class. The far right is not the only or inevitable alternative. We need to think beyond the far right. Too often in our public narratives, in our media, in academia, and with our politicians as well, as Aaron was talking about with Hillary Clinton, the far right is posited as the only alternative. It is either the liberal center or the far right. We need to think beyond this. These things have not to be, do not have to be this way. Which leads me to the final point, is that we need to broaden our political horizons and we need to return to a more emancipatory forms of democracy. Forms of democracies that go beyond simply electoral joust that take place every few years. We need to go back to forms of democracies that really empower people. If you look at the elections in 2016, for example, not only was Donald Trump not elected by the working class, but he was elected by about 25% of the registered voters in the United States, as I'm sure many of you will know. And of course, that doesn't take into account all the people who have been pushed out of the registers over the years. So we need to go back to more emancipatory forms of democracy. What we argue really is that democracy can only thrive in a society that is rid of privileges. And it is thus essential that all forms of oppression are both clearly delineated and combated indiscriminately, not as a matter of priorities. We argue that democracy must be anti-racist, as it must be anti-sexist and anti-classist, and against any and every form of oppression and where they intersect. Any less is cowardly, any less is reactionary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very informative and interesting presentation. And I'm sure there are many, many questions that the audience has. So I would like to now turn it over to Dr. Seaman to please moderate the question and answer period.
Great, thank you, Hoda, and thank you, Aaron and Aurelien, for a fascinating presentation. So I have a couple of questions that have come in already that I'm gonna go through, and then just to remind everybody, you can use the question and answer box to post questions, and we will try to get through as many as we can. So the first question is, how much importance does the role of right-wing talk radio and TV hosts have in the current populist movement?
I can start that one if you want.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a very significant role. I think we have to, I guess, distinguish between a number of things. I don't think it's a deciding factor, but the way in which you have actually almost a business model now of sort of what we call reactionaries on various platforms. Having podcasts, YouTube channels, etc., and circulating a series of talking points and a series of other figures normalizes a discussion. And oftentimes these discussions are about either denying racism, so on the more liberal side, but also encouraging sort of resentment and anger at what is perceived as a status quo. Oftentimes these, and I would give the intellectual dark web as an example of this, the way in which you have talking points about so-called cancel culture, and which there's this idea that certain ideas are not only not allowed, but you can actually be canceled for speaking them, for articulating them. And what ends up happening is that becomes almost a sort of an invitation to sort of be canceled and then appear on this sort of I guess circuit of channels. Now these are often posed as alternative to the mainstream media, and partly because of cancellation, partly because of our perception of the mainstream media as liberal in America. And by liberal, what they're claiming often to be the more liberal side of classical liberals, and they're representing the media as left wing. But you also have a mainstream media in Fox that articulates similar politics on traditional television or platforms. And then you also have more mainstream so-called moderate or centrist platforms in which some of these actors, if they get enough prominence and are seen as sort of inevitable or unavoidable, they get the platform on there. And so you've had this with a number of figures, Steve Bannon, for example, who obviously with Breitbart already had a platform. And so what it ends up doing is it ends up creating a multi-level sort of amplification and legitimization and circulation of these ideas, as well as creates icons who are often seen as martyrs for the cause. And what's interesting is the way in which that these should often discount each other, in the sense that they claim that there's no opportunity to speak or say these ideas. And I guess cancel culture is one, biological sort of race or gender science would be another. The state of academia would be another. And sort of as an academic, we sort of, we get called a lot of things about the way we're allegedly propagandizing our students. Whereas you have this completely ideological sort of business model, which claims to defend objectivity in science. So I think these have, in relation to one another and in relation to the wider both culture and obviously political establishment circulating these ideas or benefiting from them, or they advocating for them, does have a massive influence.
I think one of the other things that we argue as well, and that too often people fall for is blaming simply the right-wing media, and Fox and the tabloids in the UK, and all these kind of things. And what we try to argue in the book is that the left, or the more liberal media, whatever you want to call it, also has a responsibility. That's why we quite often go for more liberal, liberal media that is against Trump, that is against Brexit, media that is against the far right, that denounces the far right and the extreme right. And we think that while they often do it well, they also often do it very poorly by giving a platform, by creating false equivalencies, by creating false debates. And this is not just about the far right. For a very long time, for example, when it came to talking about global warming, there used to be a scientist that represented 99% of scientists who argued that global warming was a reality, and the debate was against someone who just knew nothing about it and said that it was a scam or some kind of conspiracy theory. And this is not debate. I mean, this is not helping at all. And I think the mainstream media has a lot to answer for here when it comes to platforming bad ideas. Who have been platformed many times, have plenty of other platforms, as Aaron was saying. I mean, Steve Bannon has been invited in so many prominent liberal medias to kind of push his ideas, and I think this is a very, very problematic issue, and we did write a lot about it, particularly with regard to The Guardian and the way they've covered a lot of kind of a far right, far too much, what we call populist hype, as I discussed earlier.
Thank you, that's great. That's actually answered some of the following questions too as well, so that's helpful. So building on that then, the next question is, how do you work with the denial of well-known facts? So how do we ensure that truth and kind of reality are pushed forward, especially when you have mainstream media legitimizing both liberal and illiberal racist speakers? How do you think the media should be responding? What could be improved?
Shall I start with this one? Or?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think, it goes back to, I think what we talk a lot about is accountability and responsibility in many ways when it comes to the elite. And we are part of the elite, right? We don't point to the elite as some kind of conspiracy theory and a few people in some kind of basement that are hidden. The elite are academics, are politicians, are the media, and so on. The people who have a bigger impact on public discourse, the people who can shape the agenda for good or bad. The agenda has to be shaped in big democracies. We cannot all go out and know 250 million US citizens and know what they think or how they feel across the country, and same in the UK and in smaller countries. We need to rely on people gathering information for us. And so, we have an elite or various elites that shape the agenda, but these people, we are arguing, are shirking their responsibility at the moment. They're just saying look, we're just following what the people want. And that's why we're talking a lot about immigration. That's why we're talking a lot about, we were inviting Steve Bannon. That's why we are inviting Richard Spencer. That's why we're talking a lot about these things, more than we're talking about the economy, more than we're talking about unemployment or other alternatives on the left. And what we're arguing is that there is a responsibility for these people here. And of course, the responsibility doesn't just fall with individuals, because it is a system, and it's an ecosystem as well, where our media is more and more owned by very few kind of hands, and with particular interests, with particular editorial lines. So I think if we believe in democracy, we need to fight for a better media, for a more widespread media with different ideas and so on. And so I think it requires really systemic change if we want something that is not a reactionary democracy, where democracy is only a question of elections that are held in an ecosystem that doesn't give people the right kind of information, really.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that it's one thing, you've got to counter falsities with facts, but at the same time, a lot of the reactionaries have sort of attempted to create a monopoly on truth and objectivity, and that you've got a sort of what is effectively a reactionary discursive economy, where the arguments that are sort of opposed, anti-racist arguments, for example, left-wing arguments, are seen as ideological and not truthful and biased, etc. And so the opposite must either be the truth or at least help us get there. And I think that we need to oppose, obviously, the narratives with the facts. And I think Aurelien was doing that with the white working class election narrative. But I think also it's really important that we're careful to not play the game of debate as if we have to prove our truth to someone who, to an argument that's basically not only designed, but developed around opposing our ideology as if it's truth, or at least it creates a better picture. And really, to go back to the media, I mean, make them accountable, but also not fall into the trap of saying, you know, you need two sides to every argument. I mean, there's not two sides to fascism and anti-fascism. There's not two sides to racism and anti-racism. It's the level of, you know, the democratizing these positions is dangerously anti-democratic, particularly when the existence and rights of people is absolutely denied on one side. I mean, these are not, you know, we don't have to debate whether people experience racism.
Thank you. And that follows nicely to the next question about how much you think the hyping of the far right, the use of that language as a new strategy, or I guess a repeating strategy to uphold political power. And then how do you see that feeding into, and reactionary democracy feeding into the recent protests against that?
I'll start with an anecdote which I think just showed how liberal and illiberal racism worked in the UK recently during the recent protests. So the recent protests kind of led to a moment of hope where things could change, where, you know, finally, you know, I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing that, you know, even in a lot of the media that we tend to criticize, they seem to finally realize that yes, there was such a thing as systemic racism, like as if lots of people who have been suffering from this systemic racism have been arguing for a very long time. You don't need to go very far to actually hear all the voices of the people who suffer from this on a daily basis, and yet all of a sudden there seemed to be this kind of realization that yes, this was happening and we needed to wake up to this kind of movements. And then in the UK, there were two things happened. There were some statues were torn down, and that already had the impact of people saying, oh, you know, we should save our history, blah, blah, blah. So already part of a liberal kind of mainstream started turning against the movement by saying, well, you know, we can't go too far. And then something fascinating happened as well, is there was a counter protest by the far right. And it was typical far right. It was kind of like skinhead types, people who are, you know, associated with the extreme right, but everyone would denounce, even you know, the far right parties here would more or less denounce them, really. And one of them ended up urinating on a plaque for I think a police officer who had been killed. And this became like, oh, look at these evil racists urinating on plaques and things like that. And so it kind of totally kind of derailed everything in a way, because it moved from this acknowledgement that there was systemic racism, but what was needed to change if we didn't want kind of murders on the streets of unharmed, you know, African Americans, or the same happening in the UK. If we wanted this to stop, we needed systemic change to actually know racism was just that guy urinating, that skinhead urinating on a plaque. And, you know, if these people weren't here, we would be enjoying liberal democracy. And so in a way, it is all linked, and the way liberal and illiberal racism, and why we argue the two sides of the same coin, is that they kind of, illiberal racism is very useful. The more extreme forms of racism are very useful to actually kind of keep the systemic liberal racism in place in a way, because there's always the bad other. It's like, at least we're not the neo-Nazi, at least we're not these terrible people, but we still have the structures of racism that kind of prop us up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the way in which sort of liberal democracies have sort of trained themselves to look at Nazis, or look at extreme forms, or look at the far right, going back to the sort of the illiberal racism, as the problem. I think it functions to actually, on one hand, to maintain the status quo. You don't actually have to change anything structural, which I think is why there's such a problem when you have when you champion a liberal centrist, or they champion themselves in terms of Clinton, against the far right, as the antidote, as the bulwark against the far right, and chop and sort of deny the possibility of a left, which advocates structural change. And that structural change would address or designed to address structural inequalities. Now, I'm not saying the left hasn't had problems with race and racism, but what I'm saying is that it's the centrists saying, we'll take it from here. And if you look at the very history, we talk about this in the book, the very history of the concept of the radical right, it originates in a sort of like vital center politics of unreason. Yes, I'm naming actual like the books, but and the theories, but the way in which the center is a bulwark against extremes on both sides. So you have these equivalents in which something is extreme because it is either it's racist or threatening or violent, etc. But what it does on the left is an attempt to analyze and oppose structural inequality. Now, the way in which the far right, the focus on the far right, the hyping of the far right, it reaffirms centrism, but it also reaffirms a more moderate form of either racism or gatekeeping and management of racial inequalities. And this is always why you have this rhetoric, and I think Aurelien touched on this, about, well, they've gone too far. You frequently hear this, and I do listen to all these podcasts and read about from the right and from liberals about these issues. And the frequent talking point now is, I was really on board with Black Lives Matter, but they've gone too far. And then you start to hear this creeping thing where it's like, I hate illiberal racism, the far right violence. Oh, police racism, racist violence, well, that's bad apples or a form of reverse racism against blue people. Like you get these kind of all lives matter, blue lives matter, kind of equivalent and reverse racisms that sort of say, yeah, you had a point, but you've taken it too far. And what's interesting with the British one is the way in which, just as another sort of example, is the way in which it was bad enough there was an attack on a statue of a slave trader, as if that would not be the perfect example of the illiberal racism we threw away when we covered up our liberal racism. But then they go after Churchill, because Churchill must be like the original Antifa you hear, or the original anti-racist, because he saved the world from the Nazis. And I know there's a big debate about, the special relationship in Britain and America, but I guess the interesting thing is then you go, well, actually, Churchill had some horrible things to say about Africans, Indians, Jewish people, First Nations people, and they go, well, but he was a man of his time. And you're like, but your liberal argument is that we've defeated that. It's gone. And there's a keep on, and this is what I meant about the blurry lines, is keep on a reaffirmation of this, because it's obviously, like, in some ways it's policing the boundaries of the status quo.
So could you both talk a little bit more then about where the Black Lives Matter social movement fits into your analysis? And so the idea of Black agency and the agency of people of color, where does that fit into reactionary democracy?
Well, the first thing that I want to say about this is that we are not trying to talk for people like for African Americans or other people in the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not, it's not our place. We are very much speaking from our kind of positionality, and that's why in many ways we decided to kind of study elite discourse, and particularly elite white discourse, because it is in a way what we can speak for. And it does fit. And what I think has been particularly frustrating is that a lot of the things that we uncover in the book, or we try to uncover in the book, in these kind of strategies to kind of quash any discussions around systemic racism and all of these kind of things, have been going on, for a long time. Like as Aaron said at the beginning of the talk, we are massively indebted to a lot of people who have been writing about this for years and years and years and years and years and years. So, what we're trying to write about is our current moment, but in a way, the recipes to change these things, or even the kind of diagnosis has been clear for a very long time. And I think that's what is incredibly frustrating. And so what we're hoping our contribution is to all of this is certainly not to speak for anyone who is suffering from, and certainly I couldn't speak for anyone who's suffering from systemic racism or oppression even more generally, and I'm very well aware of that, and that's where we've positioned ourselves in a way. But what we're trying to do is try a different angle in a way to kind of, you know, try to chip in at the kind of systemic nature of oppression, and yeah, do a little bit, but certainly it's going to be a long battle.
Yeah, I mean, we're not speaking for others, and we're not describing the experience of racism, but we are trying to analyze, again, this moment and the way in which, I mean, in a sense, we're trying to study racism as it's articulated and it's denied. And in terms of Black Lives Matter, I mean, we speak about them very sort of, very supportive manner, but also about the way in which racists and liberals and sort of the right have attempted to mobilize against them and try to represent them and represent wider social political activist movements as a way of both denying racism and scoring points against anti-racists. And I never seems to be amazed the amount of sort of all white panels on podcasts and YouTube channels debating whether not only Black Lives Matter has gone too far, but whether, you know, is the problem is black. If it was all, or, you know, and the way in which this Black Lives Matter gets used and deployed in the service of racism and racism denial. And so I think that's where we look at the movement. But yeah, no, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is looking more at questions of political economy. So how do the movements of global capital, the movements of jobs, triggers to migration, and the diversification of host societies affect class structure and old political alignments?
One of the things, I think we said when we did an article that sort of fed into the book as well, about the way in which the construction of the white working class and the sort of the reactionary politics aren't just a defense of the status quo, but they divide and rule. So in the way in which it's not just the right, the way in which class is actually, and class politics, class consciousness are undermined by the divide and rule, by telling white working class people that what's under threat, or what threatens them, is not capitalism. It's not elites. It's not their, industry. It's not corporations. It's not governments with austerity policies and denying healthcare, fair housing, etc. It's actually immigrants. It's other working class people, or it's people who suffer from class discrimination and inequality as well as others. And I think the whiteness is the clearest of that, because it makes it out as if race is the issue, not class. Now, the way in which, the way in which the white left behind, and one of the things that we were sort of speaking about in the book, is the way in which the white working class left behind is also a way of attaching whiteness to some form of inequality, victimization, and otherness that actually is a sort of racialized sort of pseudo-sociology, or attempt to sort of like play a grievance politics or play an identity politics in the way the right kind of mocks the left for doing it. But I think the other thing is you look at it, the way in which, if you buy into this white working class left behind, that the immigrants and racialized minorities and racialized communities are the threat to you, you don't ever have to question your wage, your labor rights, your life opportunities, and the impact of, you know, other factors of inequality, health, education, etc. And so in Britain, I would just give as an example of this, the way in which in 2010, austerity policy started in the back of the economic crisis. And there was an attempt to sort of destroy the welfare state effectively, benefits, etc. Everyone was a benefit scroungers. And this impacted the same people who would later be called the white working class left behind. And they were at a certain point, they were denied everything. They were denied housing and benefits, etc., but no jobs were coming. And halfway through, they turn around and go, but we'll give you racism. So you can actually blame the immigrants now. We're going to walk away. We're going to turn against the immigrants and be on your side. We're not giving you your opportunities back. We're not giving you equality. We're going to blame them. We're going to blame the EU. We're going to blame other sort of forces. And everything will be fine, because once that happens, your life will be good again, because you'll also get your whiteness and your national identity, but you're not going to get equality.
And again, I think this kind of diversion is not new. And I think what's fascinating as well is that while it's been quite successful, it's not usually the working class, white or otherwise, that has fallen for it, but it's more kind of a middle class, as we were talking about before, and as we talk about in the book. And we talk about it more as well in the book, in a way to show how people kind of look at the broader picture and then their day-to-day lives. And we look at a particular kind of big survey in Europe. And when people are, like the same people ask the same two questions, according to you, what are the two biggest issues facing you at the moment? And according to you, what are the two biggest issues facing your country at the moment? When it's about their country, people are far more scared about immigration than when it's about themselves. When it's about themselves and their day-to-day life, immigration doesn't rank as an issue. What ranks as an issue is jobs, health, education, pensions, things that most of us kind of see, because again, like you can see how our knowledge of our countries, our knowledge of our democracies is mediated. Again, for good or bad, we need it to be mediated, but it's mediated in a terrible way. And in the UK, it's particularly fascinating, that survey, that immigration becomes only the top concern, even for the country, during the 2016 campaign for the referendum. And during the 2016 campaign for the referendum, some colleagues have done some incredible research on that. And the media talked about immigration second to the economy, but very close second. But also most of the headlines, most of the front pages were about immigration, and immigration was most of the time talked about in a very negative manner. So it's not a surprise that then if everything that people see and read about their country and about their democracy is geared toward a particular issue, that issue will be on their mind. It doesn't mean that they will become xenophobic, that they'll become racist necessarily, but it is certainly think about it when they come to voting, rather than thinking about what really matters to them, which is, again, education, health, their children, their parents, their jobs, and so on and so forth. So it is very much a diversion, and it is very much, again, kind of something that is encouraged and fostered by the people who have an impact on public discourse.
Thank you. So the next question is, how would one overcome the inherently dictatorship of the 51%-esque nature of democracy that makes it possible to institutionally oppress minorities, specifically outside of better education regarding today's minorities and their experiences? How can we make the system, I guess, better, just to summarize?
Well, that's a huge question, and somehow that's just before that we end the book, just before answering that. No, I mean it is not in the book, and it's something that we've discussed with Aaron, and I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I think this is a very, very interesting question, the dictatorship of the 51%, but I think we could say the dictatorship of more than the 51%, and I think that's why we say that we need to look at broader, more imaginative understandings of what democracy means. That democracy shouldn't stop at someone winning by 51%. And actually, if you look at Trump, he didn't win with 51%. He won with less. And if you take the registered vote into account, he won with 25%. And so I think what we need to move beyond all that, I think, and to be more imaginative. And there's plenty of people, again, who have written about what this world could look like. But I think we need to look at it more seriously, rather than as some kind of like, yeah, they're just dreamers in a way. So I think we just need to have these discussions, as opposed to having discussions over the latest opinion poll that says what Biden and Trump are doing, because actually Biden and Trump will not be the solution that will take us closer to a real form of democracy. Of course, one will be better than the other, but this is not what democracy is about or should be about. And at this stage in the US, I totally understand that that's what people are focusing on, because there's a lot at stake. But there's a lot at stake, in the short, mid, and long term, that will necessitate a lot more than business as usual, whether it's the business as usual of the center right or Trump's right.
Yeah, I mean, sort of as academics, when we engage in very long critiques, we're often asked, well, do you offer any solutions? And I mean, in a sense, it's also difficult to do so because we're not telling other people what to do. And we're not telling particularly those on the sharp end of racism and racial inequality what to do. We're not trying to manage the process, but I think one of the issues is to be aware of that you're not only fighting structural and systemic inequality, but you're fighting an arsenal that is designed to kind of deny it and over-determine that and get it hard to get to it. Which is also why, I was very hopeful when those protests happened. And I say that with a lot of sadness and anger because of what led to it. But it's about unraveling that. And I guess also making people be aware of the politics of distraction and fight the structural and systemic issues, but not, but again, and I sort of Aurelien said this sort of quite well, but the way in which when you're scared of another term of Trump, you buy into narratives in the media that tell you this is the safer bet, when that safer bet, and it may be a safer bet, and I'm not saying that we need to sort of unpack this all here or, fight the Democrats, but actually be aware and conscious that what that alternative, what that centrist sort of model does, it doesn't address the inequalities. It doesn't address racism. And it also trains you to see racism only in its extreme illiberal forms.
And if I can
as I said, when post-civil rights, racism went on even if the Klan was gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can add to that, what we're seeing as well at the moment, and I think it's quite despairing in the kind of after the protests and the kind of rightful anger at the system is this kind of like narrative about, oh yeah, okay, but now we need to come down and we need to kind of coalesce behind Biden and we need to make him win. And it's like, well, I think the harshness that this must feel. I can only imagine, like, when clearly the protest wanted change that is systemic, change that the Democrats in the last few utterances have been, condoning in many ways, and have not been dismantling in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's why we certainly don't want to speak for the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's not for us to do it. They do it themselves very well, and what they're doing is wanting systemic change, and they're proposing solutions, but again, they're not listened to, because we need to just elect Biden first. We can't be going too far. We can't be kind of we can't be dreaming too much. And it's like, I'm sorry, but if this is dreaming, like, what are we doing, and how can we call this a democracy in many ways? It's quite incredible that we're even discussing these things in many ways. But yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to kind of mush some of the last questions together about some concrete actions that individuals can take to raise awareness, to educate themselves, to be more active in challenging this. What are some suggestions you could give?
Well, there are some. In a way, the book is not so much about about individuals and about what individuals can do, because we try to look at systemic issues, and we also try to look at the people who, again, you know, are part of this kind of the people who can shape public discourse. Of course, we can all shape public discourse. I mean, you know, far from me the idea to say that we can't, but some people have better access to the media, the people who, like academics as ourselves and so on. But I think what we can all do in many ways is of course we need to keep fighting, and what we argue in the book is that we need to keep fighting illiberal racism, you know, the kind of, you know, we need to keep going in the streets, we need to keep kind of fighting illiberal racism when we see it on a daily basis, when we see it on the streets, when it's demonstrated with flags and things like that. But I think we also need to not lose sight of a bigger target, and we need to not lose sight of liberal racism, and how, in a way, us turning our attention solely to illiberal racism might sustain, to some extent, liberal racist systemic injustices. And so what we argue really is that we really need to look at the bigger picture always. But of course, it's difficult, it's tiring, and at the moment, it does seem like a very uphill battle. But we need to do both. We need to fight illiberal racism where it is, but we need to fight the liberal racism that kind of is sustained by illiberal racism at the same time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, be aware of distractions, keep your eye on the real big picture and the real deeply rooted issues. And don't hide away or defend your own privilege or self-interest. You know, just, I mean, as someone in education, I mean, decolonize the curriculum, change what people hear, subject the system to intense scrutiny and criticism, and, I mean, protest.
Thank you both so much. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Mahmoudi to finish us off. And I just wanted to remind everybody that the book is available from Verso Books. The link is on the screen. So feel free to have a look and engage more. And then I will pass over to Professor Mahmoudi.
Thank you, Aurelien Mondon and Aaron Winter, for a very important talk at a very important time. And I think that reading the book will probably even give us further information about these very important topics that were discussed and the questions that were asked today. I wanted to just take a few minutes to tell you about our next event, which is the Baha'i Chair's annual lecture, scheduled for September 17 from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. And you will really not want to miss our guest speaker, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, we will have a conversation with her on climate science, policy, and justice. And for our other upcoming events, because we have quite a few during this fall semester, we invite you to go to our website or follow us on our social media. And thank you again to everyone who joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully on September 17. Thank you. Bye-bye.